I am someone who often is given a lot of titles for what I do. There are terms like social impact designer, community artist, social impact artist, social innovator, artivist. But in my soul, I consider myself as simply a creator. I work with people to produce, to design, to actualize different tools, provocations, experiences, and manifestations of artworks that actually get to the heart of so many issues that so many of us continue to suffer through and face. You see, I got my start in this type of creation when I was still young. I grew up in rural Mississippi, and in my hometown, until 2012, where I lived was still segregated by a railroad track from where so many others lived on the other side of our town. But because I was tested as a gifted student, that's when I got the chance to experience this other side of town and to be educated with people. So that manifestation of looking at racial equity, looking at social division, looking at poverty, experiencing domestic violence, all of these issues started very early on. And after I left college, I got a chance to go back down south. And for so long in my life, especially as a visual artist, I'd been expressing so much of these frustrations simply as an individual person. But during this experience down south in rural Alabama, after a series of tornadoes had flattened most of Hale County, that's when I started to learn the power of working with people in community, where we live, where we breathe, together. Now, that project had its own challenges that I can talk about for hours in another talk, but it taught me so much about the power of who we are and what we can do when we bring our gifts, our talents, our perspectives together. And that experience catapulted me to work with communities all across this nation, to address issues like youth development, youth poverty, food access, disparity, urban dumping, social division, questioning our own identities and who we have been told that we are versus who we really are. So I want to share a story about one of these types of projects, the mirror casket. This was a piece that came out of so many nights and so many experiences of being on the ground right down the street here in Ferguson, Missouri. Admittedly, even though I was a student organizer, I was always outspoken as a young person, I'd actually had never gone to what's called a protest. And it wasn't until August 12th, not even August 9th, that I found myself at night on the streets of Ferguson. And I took this video camera with me because I was by myself. I had just come from this Urban League Young Professionals meeting. I was in a business suit dressed up. I didn't really know what to do or what to expect. And the news had told me that out there, I would see all of these chaotic people. But when I got there, what I saw was love and community. I saw people dancing and drumming in the street. I saw Tef Poe giving chants to people. I saw women organizing and building community. I saw people like Mama Cat, who I first met at a protest, feeding the people. And on that first night, I stayed out there with folks, raising our voices, letting it be known that we do not want to be slain on our own streets. And as we were doing that, all of a sudden, this whole fleet of Humvees starts to drive down the street. And on the sides of them march these officers who were dressed in military gear, carrying guns. Some were on top of these trucks, and they pointed these big bright lights at us. And some even pointed their guns. And on this night, for the first time in my individual life, I felt threatened. I felt that even though I was not doing a single damn thing that was harming another person, I was being threatened. And so after that night, I played that video over and over and over, in clips from more nights that followed, and I was constantly haunted. And in my nightmares, I would constantly see this one image, this casket that was made completely out of mirrors, that would be carried throughout the streets in like the mist of darkness. And I couldn't shake this dream, but also, even though I'm a designer, I'm not a builder. And so even though it was in my system, I couldn't get it out by myself. So I started reaching out. I sent an email to every single artist that I knew. And I said, hey, can y'all come and help me make this happen? Can you help me get this out my system? And artists, builders, actors, organizers started to come together. And we met up at this coffee shop, and I remember bringing this sketch into this meeting with all of these amazing folks. And Marcus, one of the builders, the lead builder of this project, he took my sketch and he was like, what if we do this? Like, what if we not make it a casket, make it a coffin? And then Damon chimed in. And then Elizabeth Vega, who like organizes all of these art bills, she was like, Ferguson October is coming up. What if we actually use this thing? Through the power of just asking for help, these folks helped make this happen. And so Sophie and I, who's like an amazing project manager, we went out and we bought all the materials, we sourced some, we dumpster dived, we found it. Marcus and Derek and Damon and others, they started to get to building. When Ferguson October hit, Elizabeth Vega and some others, they created what was called an ofrenda, a series of altars that were created on Canfield where Mike Brown was shot. And they, with community help, they were able to bring this casket to life on the streets of Ferguson on that night. And after the ofrenda, guess what? They organized a bunch of men to carry this throughout the streets. This casket made of mirrors that had haunted so many of my dreams just weeks before. And what was powerful about the design of this piece was that as it was carried and people saw it and marched alongside it, it would provoke you to question and empathize with the possibility that perhaps you could be in there, that perhaps you could see yourself in the fate of young people like Mike Brown who had been shot. And when it was ultimately brought to the Ferguson Police Department, the face of it was turned forward. And people who looked at it were faced with this distortion when they looked at it. This notion of really questioning and engaging, who are we really becoming? As we allow these types of tragedies to happen on the streets of our communities. And from those moments, this casket, this piece, this artwork, this nightmare started to be carried night after night, day after day, into different police departments across the city and the region. And it started to take a life of its own in a way that made it less important who the 7 of us were, because so many people had started to put their own spin into it. They started to take ownership of it. They started to put new narratives into it. They found different ways of using it. But there was something about this piece. It was heavy. I mean, it was literally heavy, but it was also heavy. For many months after those initial weeks, it stayed in my apartment. It stayed in Derek's minivan. It was in Elizabeth Vega's basement. And all of us felt this energy where we couldn't quite decide what to do with it. It haunted us still because we had to look at it. We had to engage with it. And so we didn't know what to do. And as we were contemplating whether to smash it, to store it, to keep using it, to give it away, people started to take notice. And both on a local level and a national scale, people started to write about it. In addition to writing about it, people started to see this as more than just a provocation. And it would start to be seen as a work of art. And so it was in traveling exhibitions. It was even on an exhibition on view here at UMSL. And once it got to the Regional Arts Commission, by that time, people like Shiraz Gorman, a local poet and activist, had brought it to the attention of collectors at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And during this time, they were just on the brink of finishing what would become the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And the collectors there, upon hearing these stories about this piece and seeing it across media, because of the power of community, of every single life that touched it, they wanted it. And it wasn't just for the sake of its own nature, but they saw a bigger connection. You see, they had just collected the casket of Emmett Till, who was killed in 1955 by white racist vigilantes who slaughtered him, bashed his face, dragged him for miles after he had allegedly whistled at a white woman. This piece, this casket that was created in honor of Mike Brown and the suffering that we all felt on the streets of Ferguson became a part of the art historical canon about the abuses that had been plagued upon Black bodies across generations and centuries in our city, in our nation, in our world. And so it continued to take a life of its own because the support that we got from that institution, one, gave us that leverage and that confidence to continue to build with community, to continue to make, to continue to agitate through art, to provoke, to make us question who we really are and why are we separating ourselves? Why are we judging each other? But you see, as many members of our team have continued to make and to travel, to talk, to produce films, to do so much, we still get the question of what's next. Because guess what? They haven't stopped killing us. This year alone, almost 1,000 people have been killed by police brutality. In our region, over a dozen have been slaughtered by the police. And so we get questioned, well, what happens, or what could happen, if we were to take these caskets and keep building them and place them on the site of where every single person has been murdered, so that the community continues to question and see themselves in this fate? Will it evoke empathy to make the killing stop? What would happen if we made smaller versions of these caskets or mirrored them like shields and took them to the families of people who have been directly affected by police brutality, just to be able to say, we see you? Perhaps all of those people who were a part of the story of this piece had the space to share their story about coming into this work. What would happen when we amplify our voices that way? So this life of this piece continues on. We're still creating. We're still bridging possibilities. And I think often about that initial nightmare, that when I saw this in my head, in my dreams, I didn't know what quite would happen with it. But I knew I had to get it out my system. And I knew that there were people, I just believed that there were people around me who felt the same. And it was through the power of community, the power of the people, who allowed us to create, and through that creation, heal and become warriors, to really envision new possibilities of what could really happen if we check ourselves, if we stop dividing. And so this piece continues. We continue, all 7 of us, every single life that has touched us. And we invite you to be a part of this with us because the journey continues. So thank you.